All right, hi guys. I want to introduce you to the measurements lab. And in this lab, we're going to use several different pieces of equipment to do some measurements with. And I just wanted to give you a quick explanation as to why that matters. Why do we care? Why would we consider using something over something else to measure something? So, with that being said, you can see we have a few different versions of, or ways to measure things. We got the meter stick, a ruler, which is basically a meter stick, but just 12 inches long, or 30-ish centimeters. We have what's called a digital caliper here, which we'll show you that in a minute. And we have a micrometer. Now, and a tape measure. So, all of them do the same thing. They tell you how far it is from one point to another. Some of them do them over a very long distance, and some of them do them over a very short distance. Now, the one thing that the very short distance ones have over these is the precision of this piece of equipment is much, much, much more precise than like this one. However, you couldn't use this, really, you could, but I mean, you wouldn't want to use this to measure the length of like this desk, because that just doesn't make sense. Could you imagine trying to open this thing up to some particular distance and then going and putting a whole bunch of these next to each other on the desk? That would just be crazy. So if I was going to measure the desk, what would you normally think of using? In this case, in my mind, I would think of using either this one or this one. Why? Because the accuracy that you're going to achieve is going to be higher, because this will reach from one end to the other. Right? I can hook it on that side, and I can bring it all the way to this side. I hope you can see that on the video. And then I can just read off the measurement, right? 152 centimeters, or 1.52 meters. Right? I can read that off. It's very easy, and I go all the way from one side to the other. And I know that there's no inaccuracy happening in the middle, because it's one solid measurement. Now I could use, at the same time, I could use this, and I could line that up with that side of the desk over there. And then when it got to here, I could make a mark. Let's put it on the meter side. I think that'd be better off. I could make a mark here and say, okay, well, this is 100 centimeters. And so then I come over here from 100 centimeters, and I would mark this. And again, I have like 52.2 actually. So in this case, the first one I said I had like with the ruler, or with the tape measure, I said it was like 152 centimeters. With the ruler, it looks like 152.2 centimeters. Just hanging over a little bit. And I could use like this guy and do the same thing, and then I would have to like mark it, and then mark it, and then mark it over and over again, and add them all up as I went across the table. But the problem there is, every time I put a little mark, am I making the next measurement perfectly aligned with that mark? And so this is where you start to think about, okay, well, what do I actually need to measure something? In this case, we're measuring stuff that's pretty simple, right? Like square stuff. Like in this case, we could say this book. If I was choosing to measure this book, what would you choose for that? Well, I mean, you could choose the meter stick, but obviously this is very, very big in comparison. But I could line up one side with like 10, and then read the other side as like, right, 27. So 27 minus 10 means the distance of from there to there is 17. And I could actually use this to do the same thing. And I could say, oh, look, it's 17 point whatever. Or I could use this one. It's a little smaller, easier to manage. And so I could say 17 point whatever, right? And so I can roughly get the same measurement with all these things. Now, I still wouldn't use these because these are still on a much smaller scale. So what would you use these for? Well, if I was measuring this thickness maybe, right? I could use, again, I could use the ruler and I could say, okay, the thickness of this book is, you know, somewhere about 5 centimeters-ish. And I could say, okay, that's good. But then if I wanted to be really accurate, I could use this. And so I could make sure it's set to 0, right? So it's set to 0. And then I can just open it up and I can use in between the teeth, I can sandwich this stuff. And the nice thing is, by doing it this way, I'm removing some of that ambiguity, like when I use the ruler, where the ends could kind of come apart or whatever, because now I can squish it together. And so now I can say, oh, look, it is 4.78 centimeters or 47.9 millimeters, right? And so now I can get a very much more precise measurement, and I know my accuracy is pretty good because, you know, if I measured it again and again and again, I know it would come out to be about the same because I'm squishing all the pages and I haven't got to worry about, you know, this kind of thing happening. All right. Now, I could think about using this, but still, again, it's a little big, right? So I would have to measure like some of it and then some more of it and some more of it and then add it together. However, if I was trying to maybe measure like this set of pages, well, now trying to use something like this is going to get, I mean, you could still do it like you know, 3 millimeters or whatever, but now really you're going to want to use something like this. And so we'd use the micrometer, and so you would put that in, and so this amount of pages is 2.4 millimeters. Now, this has a very specific precision, right? And we can see it's all labeled here. And this is actually precise to 0.01 millimeters. So it's pretty precise. It has a good precision. And if I did this again and again, I should get about the same. Now this is actually has a precision of 0.001, which is micrometer. And so if I turn this on and set this to 0, and so let me just show you about this. So there's 2 knobs here that you have to think about. And these 2 knobs is, this is your rough, right here, this is your rough opening. In other words, if you grab this and turn it, you can open it up very quickly and very easily. Now, this one is almost like a torque wrench. In other words, if I were to sandwich the same amount of pages between there, and I was to close it, I would use this one, not the little one, because this one will go to a point, and you'll hear it in just a second. Kind of hard to hold everything all at the same time. But once it starts to get tight on there, right, you hear that? It's not going to go anymore. So once it reaches, it gets there and it stops. And this will not allow you to make it any tighter. If I turn this one, I could make it tighter, but then you're stressing the piece of equipment, and you don't want to do that. And so in this case, I don't know if we can see it, but we have 2.472, right, millimeters. And so you can see each one was more precise than the last. This gave us to the millimeter, this gave us to the 0.01 millimeters, and this is giving us to the 0.001 millimeters. And so the idea behind these things is specifically just for that. It's when you start measuring smaller and smaller and smaller things, it's harder and harder to measure those using something that's gigantic. And so that's where these guys come in really handy. And this will actually determine, you could actually do, and part of the lab is to determine like the page. Now I don't know if this will be the book you'll be using, but you'll be determining the thickness of the page. And so I'm just going to, and so there's the thickness of the page, 0.09 millimeters. So it's a very small thing. And so trying to measure that with this, you can tell, would be almost impossible. And so that's where the measurements come in. So there's one more thing I want to show you. So that's how you use this, right? So this is your rough opening. Don't crank it down. This is not meant to be cranked down. Just get it so that it gets snug. And then use this big wheel here to tighten it as much as it'll go. Once it reaches this point where it's done this, it means it's done. It doesn't need to be any tighter. This is the measurement. These have been calibrated very well. Okay, one last thing I want to show you. How would you measure that? This is one of the reasons for these other pieces of equipment as well, because if I told you, hey, measure the diameter of this thing, well, you could get the ruler and you could say, okay, the diameter of this thing is 5 centimeters. But is it really 5 centimeters? What if I move it down just a little bit? Well, now, if I go from edge to edge, what do you have? You have 4 point something. If I come up here a little bit higher, then I realize, oh, I must not have been at the correct spot because it's actually a little over 5. Okay, so that's where these guys come in really handy, because they give you a much more accurate way to measure these things, as well as having a higher precision, which means you can get a better measurement. In other words, I can take this guy, and because of these teeth, this thing makes for a nice measurement for things that are like this, because I can sandwich this in between there, and I know that these teeth are going to hit the edges at the farthest point. In other words, at wherever the diameter actually is. And so in this case, I can see that this thing is 51 millimeters across. All right? Again, you don't want to squeeze this thing like so hard that you do some damage, because it's meant to just come up and snug up. Make sure everything's nice. And there you go. Right? And so now you can measure, and maybe if you measure at different points, you'll notice that this thing is not truly round as you may have thought. Right? 50.6, in the middle is 50.6 and 50.6, so maybe it is pretty round. They did a good job. Okay, so you can use that. But what if I asked you to measure the inside of this thing? I said, oh, well, you could use the ruler and try and do that, but this thing is built to actually do that already. And so if you look, there's these teeth on the top here as well. And so these teeth on the top, if you put them inside and you open it up, right, and then you get it so that it won't move around anymore, then that's going to be the farthest point that it can go, and you're actually measuring that inside diameter as well. So 37.9 in this case, right? Which would be kind of hard with some of these other pieces of equipment, and even like this would make it kind of difficult. The last thing I could ask you to do, well, there's two more things I could ask you to do. I could ask you to measure this thickness of the wall, and so then you could use this to do that. And one of the nice things about this thing to do something like that is the sharpness at which these bottom ends of the teeth are. Because as this thing turns, right, the sharper the radius, the more, if this thing is thick, then it's going to hit like over here and over here, right? And so it won't give you a true measurement. But because this is nice and sharp, and these are nice and sharp, you can actually get a nice true measurement of the thickness of this guy. And so if we look, the wall is 6.4 millimeters. Now, one last measurement. What if I asked you how deep this is? So what if this was like on the surface of the table and it was just a hole, right? You couldn't really get down the side of it like you can here. This was just a hole in the table. Well, this thing is also meant to do that. So the really cool thing about this is if you use this edge down here, and I put this on the side of the hole, then I can slide this down, and you'll see that this bar starts to come out of the bottom, right? And that bar once it hits the bottom of the hole, and you can't go anymore, that is the actual depth of the hole, 38.4 millimeters. And so this guy's really cool that he can measure the inside diameter, an outside diameter. He can measure the distance, the depth of a hole. He could also have measured it like this, right? And so you could have measured it that way. So there's a lot of things. This is a very robust and not universal, but it's able to measure a lot of different things. So with that being said, these are the different things that we're going to be using, or the different pieces of equipment that we'll be using in the measurements lab. And I will see you in class. All right.